Hello everyone. The fade out means it's time for me to start talking. My name's Giles Whittell. I'm an editor at Tortoise. It's very nice to have you all here. There are 33 days to go to COP, and this is a Tortoise ThinkIn, part of our Accelerating Net Zero campaign in partnership with our lead partner in our Accelerating Net Zero campaign, Capgemini. And it's on a central question for all of us, whether we are consumers, policymakers, or farmers, or all of them, as the world heats up. Can soil save the planet? And I suppose in a pedantic sense, there's an obvious answer to that. And people are going to raise their eyebrows when I say that the obvious answer is no, because if it were true, it would have saved the planet already. So what we really mean is, if we look after the soil differently, how much of a difference could it make? And if that all sounds a little bit technical, rest assured it isn't. I was speaking to one of our invited guests last night about his cows. We'll come to them in a minute. And it was all very undry. It was wet and untechnical rather than dry and technical. And it was extremely urgent. I mentioned at the top, there's barely a month to go to COP. There is still obviously time for a breakthrough in international cooperation before or at the conference, but I don't think anyone's under any illusion that the scale of the challenge we all face now is much bigger than can be met by a single conference, or indeed a conference process. A lot of people think that it's run its course anyway. Greta is not the only one who is impatient with talk and ready for action. And hence our emphasis in the next hour and in this series of ThinkIns on what works and how to make it work. Well, how do we make a ThinkIn work? For those of you, if there are any who've never been to a ThinkIn before, it's by having everybody take part. I will come to our invited guests first, and I'll introduce them in a second, but please don't be bashful about taking part in the chat, where my colleague Ella Hill is already inviting you to contribute and produce the slides that gave us a sort of primer on the issues at hand. And also, if you hover over the bottom of your screen, you can see at the right-hand end reactions. Click on that, and you can raise a digital hand, and that will attract my attention immediately. Please do pitch in. Don't wait until the last 10 minutes, because I want to give our speakers a chance to help me wrap things up. The time will fly, but the object of the exercise is, well, from our selfish point of view, to get story ideas, because we're going to be ramping up our reporting on these issues, and we're going to be doing a daily net zero sense maker at the conference. But for everybody, the goal is to end up doing a bit less guessing and a bit more doing by a process of sort of mutual information. As I say, we've got some massively informed and passionate guests today. And I want to start, if I can, in the trenches, as it were. I was talking last night to Peter Gregg of Piper's Farm in Devon. And Peter, you were telling me that just before you got on the phone, you had moved your cows from one field to another. And I hope that I can get you to unburden yourself of some science as best you understand it in terms of biology and biochemistry. Why did you move the cows?
Thanks, Giles. Well, just a tiny bit of context. First of all, I thought those stats which went up a few moments ago were fascinating, and it helped to make me realize why we started on the journey that culminated in me moving those bullocks yesterday. It's a pedantic point, but bullocks are sort of fattening cattle. They're castrated males rather than cows, which you might say are breeding animals. But the point is, same species. 30 years ago, Henry and I made the decision to start Piper's Farm. And the reason was, I was working with my dad on an industrial system of producing food proteins. So it was industrial poultry that he had pioneered in the 1950s in this country. And we had two small children, and we realized we did not want to feed our children food which had been produced in a system where nature is excluded, which is what industrial farming is to a large extent, and particularly pigs and poultry. So we started the Piper's Farm journey. Moving those bullocks yesterday was from one part of a multi-species, herb-rich, permanent pasture, lots of different varieties of grass, lots of different root depths, moving the cattle from a piece they've been grazing for one day to the next piece that they are still in this evening. And there are two reasons for moving them at a critical moment. The first is because we want those cattle to build nutrient-rich food that we supply to our customers, and we want to give our customers pleasure, and we want to give our customers real health-giving nutritional value. That's one reason for moving them, because they're constantly content and filling their rumens with good food. But the second reason is because we move them with consideration for the soil biology. We leave sufficient pasture behind so the solar panels are still available to the incredible world of the soil biology. And that is the engine room of good farming and good food production. And that, I would suggest, is fundamental to the discussion we're having today.
And the solar panels that you refer to there is the grass, am I right?
Exactly that. And incredibly, I was in one of our fields with our bullocks a few days ago, and I read a story from the Times on my phone about some enormous machine in Iceland that has been created to extract CO2 from the atmosphere. And I'm thinking, I'm standing in the middle of a field, which is the most incredible machine for extracting CO2 from the atmosphere via photosynthesis. Nature is the most incredible opportunity, resource, piece of kit we as farmers should nourish and cherish to produce food, but also to respect its ability to look after the planet better than we could ever do.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. And I'm glad that you came sort of back at the end to point number 2, to the soil and its capacity to absorb carbon, and indeed that facility that was just opened in Cyprus to extract carbon mechanically from the air. Because as I should have said at the top, I want to try and keep the focus pretty narrowly on carbon. I'm well aware that when we talk soil, we can easily head down very important but slightly tangential discussions about organic farming, about GM, this kind of thing. I want to try, everyone's entitled to steer the conversation in other directions, but at least initially to keep focused on this urgent technical and policy goal of using soil to maximize carbon sequestration. Let me come next to Courtney Home, who's Vice President for Sustainability Solutions at Capgemini, to take a little step back. Courtney, hello, nice to see you. Peter speaks obviously as a farmer for his own farm and a network of farms that he works with, where they're doing their best to, among other things, to maximize carbon soil uptake. But I mean, we were talking yesterday, weren't we, or the day before, about the data that underpins these kinds of efforts. I want to ask you how confident we can be on this sort of larger planetary scale about the data on soil carbon sequestration, and then your sort of initial thoughts on the smart ways to scale up the kind of thing that Peter's doing.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the conversation and for inviting me along. Yeah, we were talking about this because I think it's really important. I've spent many years in ornamental horticulture before I started geeking out on technology. So I do love soil. I think it's really important. I think that improving soil is a good thing, no matter where we are. But whether or not we can start to say it's sequestering, that regenerative practices that we were just talking about can sequester a specific amount of carbon in the soil, and can we have accountability of that from a data perspective, is something that we haven't yet been able to establish. So while I would never say that we shouldn't have regenerative practices and that we shouldn't build the soil, of course we should, because it promotes biodiversity and has a whole host of other benefits that we all are aware of. There is this question that the science needs to catch up, or the technology rather needs to catch up with the science of regenerative principles. And I know there's a lot of people working on it, but we haven't quite cracked that nut just yet. And I think it's a really important one for us to focus on. When it comes to scaling the kind of work that's happening from a regenerative perspective, the whole dialogue around changing our food ecosystem and the reality of how global food systems works becomes another topic that we have to discuss. We certainly won't probably solve it in the 45 minutes we have left, but it's one of those things that I think having a community like this and the farmers and the audience as well participate in these active dialogues is a really important one, because it's a decision we have to make about what the future of our food system looks like, because it's our food system, because it's our food, and how we protect the planet, and that food system is our business, to discuss.
Courtney, just on the data.
Giles is muted.
Unmute myself. Sorry, I thought that I had the privilege of always nattering on. I didn't know. Can you hear me now?
I can.
Excellent. On the data, Ella was explaining to me that it's a French campaign that started. It's 4 in 1,000. Are you familiar with the campaign to increase the sort of average global soil carbon uptake by this much, and the theory that in other words, if you can increase year on year soil carbon uptake by 0.4%, you'll go a long way to harnessing this great nature-based solution to reduce the amount of atmospheric carbon. Is that? I mean, you started by saying that we can't yet be confident about all the data, but do you recognize those numbers?
Yeah, I think that the enhancements that we can do, and we know that soil sequesters carbon. We know that. No argument there. We just don't know at what rate, based on specific regenerative activities, and how much that specific activity leads to a specific amount of soil being sequestered. So I think if we're going to start doing things like having, carbon sequestration be the next cash crop, and then have big organizations then offset their polluting habits based on regenerative principles, that's where we start to run into trouble. Because what we really need to do is to ensure that we're actually reducing our absolute carbon, and we can prove that. So I think that's the argument that I'm making. It's that we should definitely rely on regenerative principles and start farming differently and taking all these new practices into play. But we do need to bridge that gap between being able to prove how much carbon is actually being sequestered. And it's a technology question. The soil probes aren't quite there yet. They can't get deep enough to understand what's happening at root level.
Mm-hmm. Okay. In just a second, I want to come to Professor Les Furbank. But Tom in the chat, I want you to know that I hear you. I see your point about the broader focus, and I'll come to you in a bit. But for now, I do want to stick with this sort of central question of soil's capacity for carbon sequestration, just because I feel we want to stay on that glide path towards COP and see if it yields anything concrete. Professor Les Furbank of Leeds, and also of your own farming endeavor, you were explaining with some sheep and some horses, was it? You need to unmute. Thank you. You were saying we know what has to be done in terms of actions by farmers with the soil. Do you agree with what Courtney just said about the sort of some fairly fundamental uncertainties still about how particular technologies and approaches correlate to particular levels of carbon sequestration, or are you more confident than that?
I think there's a danger that we end up talking cross purposes. There are a lot of uncertainties in detail about how this all works, not least because the effects of different actions will vary between farmers, between fields, between soil types. But we know enough to do stuff, even if we don't know enough to be able to quantify it exactly in the same way that was implied. And I'd very much like to pick up Tom's point, because I come from a farming background myself, but decided life was going to be a lot easier if I did some research rather than try to make money out of a farm. And about 20 years ago, I went over to Thailand and got in touch with a group of very poor farmers over there who were already addressing exactly these issues. The soil in this part of Thailand was typically highly degraded, very salinated, and that was because of overuse of agricultural fertilizers. But this particular group had turned it around. They turned it around by local leadership. They weren't drawing on any outside influences. So people like myself and other academics came to see what they were doing, not to tell them what to do. And they turned around from being very poor to being really quite well off very quickly, within a few years. The Thai climate helps. But the key thing that I asked was, well, you're doing really well here, but most of the farmers in the area are still suffering negative yields, still going downhill. Why was that? And the reply was that in this area, people have to be desperate to make those changes. And I'd be very interested later on to get Peter's response as to how he's finding life on this. But how do you get people to move from the current way of working to these new systems, even when they can see that the new systems do provide all these various benefits that they're after, including a decent well-being, and yet still so many don't do it? And I think for me, that's the difficult question, not how do we measure stuff.
Okay. I take your point, Les, but the difficulty of the question seems to me to mean that the answer is going to be pretty complicated too, because essentially you're saying let's get ready for massive local variation. A solution for one farmer might not be the solution for his or her neighbor in the next valley over or the next country over. So we are seeking a very sort of flexible and localized response, and that's hard, isn't it? Les? Yeah, I think you need to unmute again. I'm sorry. There you go.
Okay, yes, it is hard. And one of the problems with the industrialized agriculture approach, and I'm not against all aspects of industrial agriculture, but in general, the approach is to try and minimize variation between places and between people. And once you get that minimized, you have something which is easier to control. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. So that, for example, I've done a lot of work at the University of Leeds farm, which has been worked as a standard arable agriculture farm for several decades. And it looks fine, but actually the crops are virtually hydroponic. If you take soil samples out and just put some wheat in and let it grow, nothing happens. And as long as you put the fertilizers on, it seems fine. But the real problem is that as soon as you get changing conditions, as soon as you get flooding, as soon as you get drought, the soil isn't capable of coping with that. So we've got to get away from this, everything has to be the same view of the world. And that means you've got to allow people to do their own thing, because they or their friends or their network are the ones that can advise them how to manage it.
Okay, thank you. So you've got to advise people to do their own thing. You've also got to sort of galvanize them, incentivize them to do the right thing with a sort of expanded sense of self-interest. And Tom and others, I detect a lot of appetite in the chat for talking about the other benefits of regenerative, sustainable agriculture, and so and we will get to that. But first, let me come to Catherine Chong, who's had many incarnations, as it were, a former sustainability advisor in Malaysia, works in impact investment, and is co-founder of Farms to Feed Us. Catherine, thank you for joining us. Now, we were talking a bit yesterday about the importance of making this challenge affordable and worthwhile for individual farmers, and I'd like to get to that. But first, give us, because I think you have a really global sense of the challenge. Where does, in terms of the narrow challenge of cutting global carbon emissions, and I know people might think that I'm becoming a monomaniac on that, nature-based solutions is a whole category of solutions to that. Where do you see soil carbon in the broader range of nature-based solutions?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. And I think I got to be a bit naughty here.
Please be naughty.
I'm sorry, because there's nothing narrow about the challenges we're facing. And I think part of, if I may, I think part of the incredible instances of cognitive dissonance in nature, climate, food, consumerism, industrialism thinking is that we're trying to narrow it down to one isolated issues. But and we have to go back to the principles of nature-based solution, is that nature doesn't work in an isolated way. It's interconnected. We've got to look at the dynamics, the interplay. And for that, I would say rather opportunistically, it's not narrow, but I think quite excitingly, there are opportunities to look at all these issues or at least change the political and the public narrative of how we look at solving climate, food issues in more connected ways. So if I can start with that.
Yeah. Okay. So if it's wrong to look at one issue in isolation, even if it's a very big, unwieldy question, what are the other nature-based solutions that in an ideal world you would see us working towards simultaneously?
Well, I think I'll correct myself there, or rather add on to say that I think it's not wrong to discuss it in isolation, but perhaps when we think about the solution, we mustn't look at it in isolation. So I think rather than one example, I think it'd be interesting to look at the context of the UK. Over 70% of our land is agricultural land. And so, you know, to that as a starting point for us to look at carbon sequestration, or rather carbon capture technology as that sort of next futuristic solution, is actually not looking around, you know, the solution that's already here, right around us, right at our feet. Yes, it's not the panacea. It will not solve all problems. There's a lot of challenges, quantification challenges, and I'm sure, you know, Les could talk a lot more about the issue of carbon cycling and distinction between carbon sequestration and carbon storage. Yes, you know, this is a very big topic we're trying to discuss here. But if we, for today, you know, if it's helpful, I think it is, if we could look at agricultural in the way that it addresses biodiversity loss, food security, the nutrients that soil need, that biodiversity need to flourish, and people need to flourish. That would be where I think we could go.
Okay. By the way, I mean, from a scientific perspective, do we know that if we juggle all those plates at once, that if we prioritize all those different things at once, that will lead us to an agriculture, a new agriculture that, incidentally, is also the best from the point of view of soil carbon uptake?
I think you got me on that keyword, priority, and that's always going to be that political challenges of, you know, when we've been talking about all these things philosophically, but part of, you know, I talk about cognitive dissonance, and part of the issue of not having all stakeholders, people representing different knowledge, in instances, scientists and farmers on the same in the same table, is that it's hard to find how should I put it? The representation does not always reflect the priority. And I think we've seen a lot of instances, particularly in the UK, that policies are made without involving the main stakeholder. So, you know, what I think is priority is obviously fitting my experience of the world. I grew up in a farming, farming family. We were very much messed up by industrial agriculture. So there's some personal agenda as well as interest that I have. And so, but that does not necessarily reflect on the priority of certain industry or certain collective of society. So I'm afraid I don't have the answer, but generally, I would think that part of the problem is that we don't have the representing stakeholders to decide what those priorities should be. Right.
Okay. So we're already into sort of governance structures, and as we have learned in other related ThinkIns, it sort of has to be everything at once, doesn't it? It's not just within this subject that we have to address everything at once.
Well, if I may add, and just to put into the context, I mean, the recent assessment report, the AR6, the IPCC AR6, there's a reason why it's called, you know, the physical science of climate change, in that we've got to look at the physical science first, but also as important is to look at the social science, the political sciences. How do we get different stakeholders working together that in the way that we could balance what we understand about Earth governance processes, as well as the social aspects, the governance aspects of meeting this huge challenges that humanity are facing.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Let me come to Tom Scope and then Viola King-Forbes, if I may. And Tom, you were first out of the blocks with an appeal to broaden the focus. Tell me why my monomania for carbon sequestration is misconceived. Can we, Tom isn't coming on, that's fine. Viola, I can see you at the top of my screen. I think you had a similar sort of message. Can we unmute Viola?
Yeah, sure.
Hi.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how similar my point was to Tom's, but I was just thinking the title, Can Soil Save the Planet, is kind of exactly the right question. And that I think it's easy when we're discussing saving the planet, or indeed saving ourselves, to just talk about emissions. And emissions are obviously, net zero is the way to prevent catastrophic climate change, but we have to ask, why are we preventing climate change rather than let's just reduce emissions? We're not reducing emissions because we want to reduce emissions. We're reducing emissions because that is the way to prevent things that then affect us. And so I think we can also look at the actions that we're doing and look at the ways in which they help us reach that, either through reducing emissions or through sort of roundabout ways. For example, increasing soil quality not only helps us reduce emissions, but also vastly increases the nutrition of our food. And increasing our quality of life includes increasing our nutrition security, as well as reducing the impact of warming. So I think it wasn't sort of a counterpoint to anyone, it was just remembering that we're not reducing emissions for the sake of it. And there are multiple ways to look at the actions we take. And that helps you sort of think about why you need to tailor what you do farm to farm, because there's not one thing to do. We're not just reducing emissions, we're trying to do a lot of things at once.
Are you a farmer, or do you have a farming background?
No, I have done research on farming at university, and then I've spent some time on farms, volunteering on farms recently. But no, not personally from farming.
So a really interesting point that's come up in conversations leading up to this session is whether farmers themselves have, broadly speaking, changed their priorities and seen a new role / responsibility / priority for them to be sustainability. I think Peter was explaining yesterday that sustainability farming used to be the definition, can I pass this down to the next generation? And it's a broader definition now. Now, I am told that Les has his digital hand up. Yes, Les.
Yeah, hi. I just think it's worth bearing in mind how intensive agriculture has been very, very successful. And one of the key things about it is that it has provided cheap food for a lot of people, whereas there are costs involved in making these changes. So it's not good enough to expect the farmers just to do this stuff. There has to be some benefits for them, and they have to get something out of it for themselves as well as for the planet.
Right. And you mentioned that there's an afforded, okay, we'll go straight to Peter on this. Peter, respond to Leslie's point if you like.
Yeah, I'm delighted to, Giles. So two things that I feel draw threads together in this discussion. First of all, Courtney talked about carbon sequestration as potentially, and I don't think she was promoting the idea, but that it would become the next cash crop. And Les then made that really interesting reference to his experience in Thailand of being amongst a group of local farmers who had taken back control of their own destiny. And the point I want to make is really the farming industry lost its sense of direction and purpose. And let us not forget, the job of farming is to feed our global population with wholesome, healthy food. That's what a farmer should do. But what has happened since the war, the process has become industrialized, and the decision-making has been driven by big corporate power who have a different agenda. And I believe that those farmers in the area of Thailand that Les was referring to, those farmers who just almost couldn't get off the treadmill enough to believe there was another way. And that is what has happened to many, many thousands, hundreds of thousands of the smaller farmers around the world. They have been caught up on this industrialized, globalized treadmill of turning farming into a series of homogenized cash crops. It should not be. Each local area of the planet should manage their natural resources in the best way suited to that particular area. And to make the final point, there is something that is now being called maximum sustainable output. And what it means is that a farming business will go on increasing output until the point at which it becomes profitable. That is maximum sustainable output because they are working with nature's resources, which, as I said earlier, are free. Photosynthesis is there and available and free. It doesn't involve any industrial inputs. Beyond that, the industrial system ramps up output for more and more and more quantity of apparently cheap food. It, at the same point, reduces profitability, and the only people who win are the people selling the industrial inputs. We've got to row back from that to maximum sustainable output, where farming businesses are working in harmony with nature.
Thank you, Peter. Let's come to Courtney, who you've effectively raised your hand in the chat, Courtney.
Sorry, yeah, we're not allowed to download Zoom, so I can't raise my hand. Agree with what you guys are saying. I can't fault anything really what you're talking about. I think the one thing that I did want to mention is that I believe that farmers should be stewardships of the land, regardless. And I think that you're right that we've been a little bit misguided since the war to farm in a different way. But you have to remember as well that we are feeding a global community. And with that comes a great responsibility. And we have to be aware and understand that we might have less food available if we drastically change the way that we have been feeding everyone for the past, say, 45 years. So I think that there's a lot of things to consider when we think about this, because there's a huge responsibility on the global farming community. And we know it's darn difficult to make a profit now. And I think it's up to us as consumers to not expect to pay 50p for a bag of carrots anymore, right? I think we have to be able to transfer those margins back to the farming community as well, so that they can enable these sorts of innovation and we can help them change their behavior and try new practices. I would love to hear, what Les has to say about this as well. I think, coming from your research background and then your agricultural background, how do you think the global food system needs to change so that we can start to think about regenerating the soil and adding more value back to the way that the farming community helps solve some of these biodiversity issues and erosion issues and all the other issues that we're causing because of the farming system that's today?
It's a great question, and we'll put it to Les in just a second, but I want to take advantage of my ability to interrupt, to just ask this, again, in my role as carbon monomaniac. A lot of the world is covered by ocean, a lot of the rest of it is covered by forest, and a lot of the rest of it by farmland. Let's take the forest and the farmland. There seems to be consensus that both have a critical role in reducing atmospheric carbon. With forests, there's nobody else living there, so the argument that there's consensus that we need to expand it as much as possible, protect it, especially old growth, as much as possible. With farmland, it's obviously more complicated because people live on it, work on it. It has multiple roles. One of them, Courtney, as you just said, producing food to feed the world. But are we at a point, and Les, perhaps if you could pick up on this, it may be a much less acute question than Courtney's, but are we at a point where the world needs to subsidize farming and farmland in the same way and for the same reasons that the world needs to subsidize the preservation of forest for with a single-minded purpose, namely to reduce the level of atmospheric carbon?
I would suggest that the answer to that one depends who you are and where you are. But in a place like the UK, we're expecting the farming community to come up with public goods. They need to be financially supported. So I think, yes, that needs to be put in place. But I would like to bounce that back to Peter because I'm curious as to why farmers in his area aren't all part of his network, and what does he think would help change their minds?
Do you want that answered now, Giles?
Well, yes, go right ahead. I've talked too much.
Okay, so I mean, it's a good question, Les, and I think if you spoke to our younger son, who thankfully now runs the front end of our business, he believes our model should become the mainstream ultimately, but there is a limit to how quickly we can scale it. But the point is, does the model make sense? I believe the industrial globalized food system is currently very dysfunctional. It's important, and I'd make this point to Courtney, that currently 70% of the food on the planet is produced by small-scale farmers. It is the industrial global system which is dysfunctional because that is a very small number of giant corporations feeding a system in this country of a relatively small number of very big retailers. What we are developing is a digital platform that links multiple small-scale farming businesses with many thousands and ultimately, hopefully, millions of individual consumers. And we know that number of consumers is growing for two reasons. One, there is a growing awareness of the link between the food you put in your body and your health. And it is very much focused around the gut biome, which should be in harmony with soil biology. And the second point is those principles which Viola alluded to earlier is what we would call agroecology. The farmed landscape should not be a barren industrial wilderness filled with big machines and agrochemicals. It should be a living, working place where the rural community is of huge benefit in many societal ways, as well as producing nutrient-dense, wholesome food for everybody. This is not just for an elite target market. This is the way populations should be fed, and it's the way the farming industry should be encouraged to operate. And we're doing our best, Les. We'll keep you posted on the growth rate of the number of farmers we involve. But, you know, ours isn't the only place or way it could be done. It's the principle could be rolled out.
Thanks, Peter. I'd like
Peter,
to cut.
Just really quickly, if I may,
Yep.
Peter, I have to say I completely agree. I mean, I produce 80% of my own food and have done for many years. And I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in such farming community. So I completely understand. I've also worked for a very large organization as well. And I've also helped Tesco with their food supply chain too, and educating farmers globally. So I see both sides of the world. And I think you're right. I think the balance is how do we enable that food that is being locally produced to be eaten by those people locally? And how do we encourage agriculture that's more local and for people to eat more seasonally? And I think that that's a big part of the problem as well.
Thanks, Courtney. I'd like to come, if possible, to Fran Bailey and then David Cleary, who've both said interesting things in the chat. And then I want to come back to Catherine Chong before we run out of time. But Fran, I just wondered, in view of what you've said about the amount of food we waste, whether you wanted to pick up on what Courtney was saying about our capacity to feed ourselves ecologically, if only we'd waste less. Are you there, Fran? Perhaps not. Okay, no problem. Now, David Cleary, you have put an interesting point in the chat about the current legislation going through Parliament. And actually, I'm slightly alarmed by one of the middle sentences. You can imagine a future where a carbon dimension gets bolted onto that. I should have read this legislation. I haven't. Is it not bolted on already?
Not really. The legislation's. I mean, there are good carbon outcomes in the legislation, but it's not an explicit objective of it. It's creating an incentive structure that's trying to reward farmers more around things like biodiversity outcomes, water quality outcomes, creating more pollinator habitat, that kind of thing. So it will have positive impacts for carbon, but as I understand the interest of this group, you're kind of interested in looking at sort of soil and carbon as a climate mitigation strategy, and I imagine Courtney's also interested in the sort of financial dimension of that, of ways in which you can take advantage of carbon markets in order to incentivize the kind of sort of behaviors around increasing organic matter in soil that you'd all like to see.
Yes, well, I'm certainly interested in the carbon component. My sense is that everyone else on the call is more interested in the co-benefits, or more enlightened than me on how they all work together. And I'm just getting my head around that. But I'm still interested, given the fact that the UK is hosting COP, and given the importance of this singular issue, that it's not mentioned explicitly, or at least along with the co-benefits in the legislation. I wonder how long that will take to change. Catherine Chong, can I come back to you, because one of the things that we talked about yesterday, and I'd be interested to know if anyone else, invited guests or anybody else, have views on this, is how regulators or policymakers make life easier for people like Peter. What are the tried and tested incentives or other regulatory arrangements that make what is right also affordable and, let's face it, profitable?
That's a very big question. But I'll approach that by actually going back to one of your questions earlier, which is if farming needs subsidy. I would actually say the agroecological farmers, the sort of farmers that Peter has been talking about, are subsidizing us. They're subsidizing the communities. And in fact, I think quite perversely, they're expected to fix poverty. And that is not the job of farmers. That's the job of regulators. That's the job of our government. So I think if you look at if we change the way that we change the time frame of how we look at social and ecological issues, then we actually all pay the cost. So, you know, I think the arguments of how changing farming practices would, in the short run, reduce the number of food that's available for people, I think that's a rather narrow discussion of the issues, because we don't just rely on satiety to survive. We rely on a healthy environment, on a healthy ecosystem to survive, and that means clean air, clean water, and so on. And farming is part of that equation. And so, and also, I think in the COP discussion, we talk about, you know, and I totally love your, you know, what you call as your obsession for soil as solution. I think it's quite important to look at the issue of irreversibility and some of the climate driven impacts that we are seeing now and will continue to see for decades and millennium. And I think that bring us to looking at soil, not just thinking about the reduction and prevention of emission, but also how do we enhance the uptake of carbon in the terrestrial atmosphere, in the atmosphere, and that's where forestry, as well as agriculture, as part of the bigger land use management, is part of that conversation and part of the solution.
So this comes to the difference, as you were mentioning earlier, between sequestration and storage. Right. Can I just, while we still have time, Peter, I see your hand is up, but I want to come to Les on this briefly. I want to quote you a line from a piece in Nature last year. The practical implementation of soil carbon climate strategies lags behind the potential, partly because we lack clarity around the magnitude of opportunity and how to capitalize on it. We lack clarity around the magnitude of the opportunity. It's only a year on from that. Do we still, and I'm sorry to harp on about the same component of this discussion, but do we still lack clarity about the magnitude of the opportunity?
We do, but I think we have enough clarity.
Okay.
We know that this is one of the few technologies that we can roll out at a large scale very quickly if the conditions are right. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter to me whether we get the estimates wrong by 5–10% or whatever. It's going in the right direction. And if we don't do this, and this has to be as well as other ways of controlling our carbon cycle, but what else have we got that can be rolled out this quickly? This is one of the few games in town.
Okay, so Peter, you've got your hand up, but I want to ask a specific question. What are the 2–3 practical things that you would ask a neighboring farmer to do if they were going to join your network, if they were to switch from being a traditional, not necessarily sustainable, to your kind of farming in absolute practical terms? What does it involve? Moving cows around more quickly?
Well, I just want to actually make reference to what Kathy's just said. The first point is farmers should not be trying to solve the problem of societal poverty. We have customers, and I know they do not necessarily have a lot of money, but they definitely don't waste food. And this answers your question, I think, Giles. Is food that has been produced industrially is too cheap, people do not respect it. And in industrial farming, the inputs are too cheap. So nitrogen that is made in this huge Teesside factory with CO2 as being a byproduct, bizarrely, but nitrogen is far too cheap. And it is the thing which is destroying soil biology. So the first thing we say to our neighboring farmers is stop using industrial inputs and start to respect nature, because nature is an incredible resource. It's not a new technology. It's been around for billions of years. And all we're asking the farming industry to do is go back to the future and respect the incredible power of nature and strip out those inputs, those industrial inputs. All they're doing is making money for the people who sell them. They're destroying the planet, and they definitely are not the friend of the farmer.
Take out those industrial inputs. So go ahead.
If I may add about industrial input, perversely, whilst synthetic inputs like fertilizer is cheap, but perversely it actually is one of the largest costs for farmers. Some farmers would probably spend up to 30–40% on the cost on synthetic fertilizer, because we have de-skilled farmers in the process of industrial farming, whereby the way that they learn farming is spray and spray and spray. And some of you might actually already seen a motor car enthusiast taking on farming, and he saw the tetrates of farming as other than big machineries is synthetic fertilizer.
We're talking about Jeremy Clark.
That's not farming, that's an industrial process.
Courtney, very briefly, if we take out the industrial inputs, as Peter would like to, can we still feed the world?
We don't know. We don't know. We don't know. I think it's, we don't know. It's such a, it's such a complex topic. I think if we, if we're going to, we don't know.
We don't know because we haven't tried it. I mean, what we've had instead is the Green Industrial Revolution, which was dependent on fertilizer and did manage to feed the world. But
so the deal is like our population has increased so exponentially in line with the agricultural revolution that we don't know if we can feed the planet based on different practices. Now, we do know that we are wasting a lot of food right now in the current system. So can we feed the planet now with the amount of food? Absolutely, 3 times over. So if we were to reduce waste and slowly change and shift and then monitor progress and do it systematically and quite strategically, we can get to a future where we're not reliant on big agrochemical. Catherine, I can't agree with you enough around the role of fertilizer, and it also increased, pesticide and insecticide and fungicide use as well, because the soil isn't protecting and enhancing, and producing good quality plants. And you have poor quality plants that are weak, you get more problems. It's again, it's full circle, right? Healthy soil is good. Whatever we can do to promote healthy soil will yield more nutritious, healthy plants, and then it'll create more, biodiversity. It's again, very cyclic. I know that we were meant to be talking about carbon sequestration today, so that's what I kind of prepared myself to talk about. But I think we have to be strategic in this rollout, and I think that we should be thinking about this rollout. And I know a lot of organizations are thinking about this rollout. Sorry, Catherine, go for it.
Okay, Catherine, you are going to have the final word because it's 2 minutes past. Go ahead.
Oh dear. Well, so yes, we haven't have a huge, a large-scale data telling us that agroecology could feed the whole world, but we're looking at enough numbers of farms that have transitioned agroecology, and we're looking at even in the UK. So with Farms to Feeders, we work with over 400 farms in the UK, and we're looking at very small plot, say a 5-acre. Could feed a whole family. Could feed a family of 4 and feed 100 families in a week with just 5-acre land, and you can't even park 100 cars within that space of land. So we don't need to convert all land into agricultural land to feed the whole nation if we're just looking at the UK.
Catherine, thank you very much. I'm afraid I have to draw a line under things because we've gone over time, but thank you very much for a conversation which has shown that my obsession with carbon I think we did, Courtney, we did talk about carbon sequestration, but it's shown that it just has to sit within a fairly complicated and nuanced, broader discussion about the co-benefits, or the other benefits of sustainable agriculture. There was consensus certainly on this call, except for the note of caution from Courtney at the end, that we can feed the world with this sort of agriculture. But Courtney's point, I think, is important, that we haven't tested it yet. There are just so many people on the planet, and so many currently do depend on those industrial outputs that Peter wants to extract. And I think that is certainly an experiment that we should undertake, and the benefits could include more carbon uptake, which is an inversion of where we started, but nonetheless positive. I was really struck towards the end by what Les said about the fact that we have enough clarity. We don't need absolute clarity. We have enough to proceed. And if there's variation of 5 or 10% here or there, we know there are ways to feed the world more sustainably, and, to my obsession, with a substantially greater soil carbon uptake. Thank you all again. There's other great examples, including the story of the degraded and undegraded land in Thailand, and the different yields that generates, and many more that I won't list now because we've gone over time. But as I say, this is one of a series on how to accelerate net zero. I'm very grateful to Courtney Home, to Peter Gregg, to Catherine Chong, and Professor Les Furbank for joining us, and everybody else. It's huge, and I hope that we can come back in future ThinkIns to some of the issues raised here and pick them up where we left off. Thanks very much.